Alright, so after something that you could call a summer break, here I am back at YouTube Business with a new video. And now since it's 2025, it goes without saying that now everything needs to be with AI. So I thought it would be really nice to show a video where I'm utilizing AI-based functionalities within Dataverse plugins. Now, to be a little bit more specific, I will show you in this video how you can use Mistral Document AI large language model to parse the information from PDF documents that are being uploaded into Dataverse. And yet, just before we jump into the code, as usual, let's go into drawing board and let me show you exactly how this whole thing would look like in the picture. So everything starts with the client. In our particular case, it will be a PCF control, but it could be anything else. It could be, for example, Power Automate Flow or Canvas application or even third-party app. Now, our client will take a document, will encode it into base64, and then send it as HTTP request to our Dataverse plugin custom action. Now, within our custom action, two major things will happen. We will make a request to Azure AI Foundry Mistral Document AI model to extract text from that document, and then we will send this document's context as text to OpenAI GPT 4.1 model so that it would be converted into JSON format. Once we get our JSON back, we can then utilize that information in order to create an invoice entity. All right, so we got our theory out of the way. Now we can jump into your environment and have a little demo. As you can see, I already opened one of the fake invoices that I have. I asked ChatGPT to create me one. We see a couple of fake companies and an invoice line, and this is a Lithuanian invoice if you're interested. So let's see what happens if I try to import this invoice into my Dataverse environment and run the plugin. So here I am in my Dataverse environment, and you can already see my PCF control. So what I will do is that I will drag my invoice in here and I will say upload file. And now what will happen is that my PCF control will, actually it already did. It sent the HTTP request to the custom action, and then custom action with the help of a couple of AI agents parsed the information from the PDF file and created an invoice record. With only 4 fields. There could be more, but for the demo's sake, I just limited myself to less information. So that's about it about the demonstration. Now we can actually jump into Visual Studio and see how the code is written. So there is one last stop before we actually go into the code, and that is Azure AI Foundry. Now, I already created a project and I'm not going through the steps on how to do it. There's plenty of information about it, and actually I don't feel like I'm the best person to showcase that functionality. In Azure AI Foundry, however, we will go into models and endpoints, and in here we will deploy our model. Now for Mistral Document AI, we will search for Mistral, and in here we will see an option. So we will go through deployment. You can change your deployment name or customize it, but I will go by default. So once that is created, you will see all the relevant information within this deployment, which will be important later on when we will look into the code. And there is one more model that I need to deploy, and that is GPT 4.1. Of course, you could actually try and play around with different models. Maybe it's a little bit of an overkill from my point of view to use this GPT model, but yeah, I just went for the safest option, if I may say so. So I will deploy my GPT 4.1. And again, once the deployment is made, there is this really nice section where you can see how to make a demo request, and all your target URIs and keys and everything will be placed inside of here. And that is done. Finally, we have our deployments, and now we can actually go into the code. So finally, I am in my Visual Studio, and in here I have my Dataverse custom action, which is a Dataverse plugin. Now, if you're unaware or you have no experience with Dataverse plugins, you can check my other videos. But we will start by examining the credentials and URIs that we will be using to access our AI models. And let's go by each and every one of those. So first of all, we have our Mistral Document AI model, which is just the Mistral model that we will be using. So in this particular case, it's Mistral Document AI 2505. Then we have our Mistral Document AI API key, which you can find in deployment. Now, for obvious reasons, I'm not putting it into my YouTube video, but you can find it in the deployment. Same goes with the Mistral Document AI endpoint, which is the target URI that you will find in deployment that you can use to make this API call. Now, Azure Cognitive Services endpoint, you won't find it in deployment, but actually you can find it in your Azure AI Foundry overview view, where you can select Azure OpenAI and you will be presented. But general rule of thumb is that your cognitive services endpoint will have the same end which is OpenAI Azure.com, and in the middle goes your Azure AI Foundry name. So basically, in my particular case, it's YouTube video Azure AI Foundry.openai.azure.com. And then again, Azure OpenAI API key. This is the key that you can actually find in your deployment. So next stop is our execute method, which is the entry point for our plugin. And in here we have our usual suspects that are tracing service, context, service factory, and service. And then we have a try-catch block in which our actual logic resides. So of course we have some tracing, but more importantly, we are checking if two input parameters exists. Base64, and I know I lied, I'm also sending a file name to my custom action. And if those values exist, we are just assigning them to variables. Then we are taking that base64 string and actually converting it into array of bytes by using convert.fromBase64 string method, which comes from the .NET framework. Once we have our byte array, next thing that we are doing is that we are checking what kind of content type we are working with, because it will be a necessary parameter for Mistral Document AI. And now with document converted into byte array, and when we know what kind of content type we have, we can finally make our first call to Mistral to actually convert the contents of that PDF file into the text that could later on be fed into another AI model. And that leads us to the next part, in which we are actually then sending the content that we got from Mistral Document AI into our OpenAI GPT 4.1 model to retrieve a JSON file based on certain schema. And then we can, deserialize that JSON into an entity class that we defined for invoice record. So finally, when we have our invoice class with all its properties, we can use those properties to create an invoice record in Dataverse. And this should be already familiar if you've seen my other YouTube videos, because we're just using service client create method to create an entity record. And that's about it. So this is the general logic. And now we will go into each and every one of those more complex methods to see what's happening inside there. And I will start by get content type from file name, because convert from base64 is a system method and there's not much to explain, to be honest. But this one is accepting the file name as an input parameter, and then it's actually returning the MIME type that would match the file extension of that file name. And MIME type, it stands for, and I've written down as a comment because I don't remember, as a multipurpose internet mail extensions. And this is a standardized type, so basically it allows systems to know what kind of file they're dealing with. And yeah, and basically here, depending on the file, we're just returning different MIME types, so Mistral AI would know what kind of file it's reading. And that's everything this method does. Now, if you might be asking, why do we need this method? And the reason is that we're not always be dealing with PDF files. So for example, you might want to reutilize this method to, for example, read document files or maybe pictures or something else. That is why we need this method to understand or to let Mistral AI know what kind of document it's reading. Okay, so next one on our list is the one that is responsible for communicating with Mistral Document AI. And in here, we begin with actually checking our MIME type. So we got our MIME type from the previous method, and in here, we're checking what kind of MIME type we have and what kind of next steps we would need to do with it. So for example, if it's application PDF, then it's all good. We're just assigning a MIME type as application PDF, and then later on we will add it as an input parameter for our API call. But for example, if it's Microsoft Word document, then there might be additional steps that we would want to do. So for example, first of all, convert that document into PDF and then apply the MIME type and so forth. So depending on the MIME type, we need to perform certain operations for our file. Okay, so our next step in general is just building the payload. And that consists of two steps. So first of all is building data URL, which is just a string. And the next one is actually building the payload object. So for data URL, first of all, we are converting our byte array into base64. And now you might be scratching your head and thinking, okay, in previous method, we took the base64 string and then converted it into byte array. And now again, we're changing from byte array back to base64 string. Now, this is happening just because I have this additional if statement in which I'm converting, in case it's a document file, into PDF, and then I need to have this byte array. Other than that, you could, if you are not considering to accept any document files, then you can skip that step and straight away pass into this method base64 string. But in my case, I was expecting document files, therefore I have this byte array parameter. And as continuing with our logic, we have this payload creation instance in which we are defining the model for our API call, which is, as I remember correctly, Mistral-AI-2025, and that comes from our Azure AI Foundry. The next step is actually creating the object inside of object for a document, and that document has a type which comes from Mistral AI documentation, and document URL is that data URL that we just created. And last parameter is defining if we really want to read the pictures that are included into our PDF in this particular case. So for example, in my case, I'm not reading any pictures because those are invoice PDFs, and the pictures that I might have are the company logos that I don't really want to read. But in some cases, you might get, some other document with some pictures that might have very important information. And in that case, you would want that parameter set to true. Okay, so our next two steps are sending the request and then parsing the response from Azure AI Foundry. So to send a request, I'm simply using an HTTP client because this is a Dataverse plugin. And well, for example, if you would be in Azure Functions, you might be using some sort of fancy library to do that. But in this particular case, I'm just using a simple HTTP post async method. So I'm defining my request headers for authorization to add the secret from Azure AI Foundry as a Mistral Document AI API key. Then I'm defining my endpoint, which again you can find in Azure AI Foundry, where I showed you previous in the video. Then we're serializing our object, which is a payload. So we had this object, and then we're converting into a JSON string that we can send it over with HTTP request. And then we are using the HTTP client to call post async method and to get the response. And then finally, we are just reading that response into a body so that we would get a string value of the response. So next to the parsing part. Now, I must admit something. I'm not really proud of it, but I was really lazy and I allowed ChatGPT to create this method for me, or this part of the method for me. And I'm not really a fan of it, and let me explain why. So usually how I would do this, I would just create a class of response that I'm expecting to get, and then I would use JSON convert deserialize method to deserialize the JSON straight away into the class, and then I would try to access the properties in the code. Now this one is actually working and checking the JSON objects along the way. and it looks a little bit messy. So what I did, I just left the comment of the response that is expected and how it should look like from the Mistral AI if everything went well. And then we can, when we're running through this code, we can always rely on the response body string to understand what is actually happening. So first of all, we are parsing our body into JSON object, which is again a Newtonsoft class, which is somewhat fancy and has some fancy stuff in it. So we're creating this J object of document variable. And then, as you can see, this is the whole object. This object has a property or array called pages, and then we're parsing as JSON array into variable pages. Now then we're checking if this pages is not null, and if it's not, then we're creating a string builder, which is a .NET framework out of the box class instance that allows you to create strings in efficient way, let's say that way. Next, we are, as you can see, the pages is array and it has a lot of objects. Well, not a lot, but two. We are looping through each and every one of those. So inside of the pages, we're checking for each particular page, which is a JSON object, and we're checking if that JSON object is not null. Now, for that JSON object, we are trying to get a property, first of all, a markdown, which is something that Mistral AI will respond with, for example, if your document has a lot of highlighting, headings, or something like it, so that metadata will go into markdown. So we are checking if markdown JSON object is inside of our response, and if so, then we're appending that markdown to our string builder. And then if it's not a markdown, it might be a text, which is the content from our, in this particular case, PDF file that can also be then parsed as a string and then appended to our string builder. And finally, we are just combining everything into variable called combined and trimming everything that's unnecessary and returning that combined string into our parent method. And also we have a little bit of fallback methods if our parsing was not successful to return the information as follows. All right, so this is the last method, and this one is responsible for taking the content from Mistral AI that we got from our PDF file and sending it to our OpenAI LLM to parse it into a JSON format that later we could use for our invoice creation. So we start actually by creating a prompt, and you can see that this prompt is quite big, and we are defining quite a lot of data inside of it. So we are checking invoice number, line items, tax amount, and so on. So we are defining the prompt, and we are also providing the invoice text, which we got from our Mistral AI. So once our prompt is created, same as with Mistral AI, we are creating a payload, but in this particular case, the payload is a little bit different because it's a different LLM. But in here, we are defining the model, we are defining our messages. So one is the system message and the other one is the prompt. With the system message, we're defining what this agent should do. And with the prompt, we're just providing the input for it. And then we're giving some parameters for it. So those parameters you can play around with, but I'm not discussing them at this point. So as with Mistral AI, same goes with the OpenAI that we are creating an HTTP client. But in this particular case, there might be some different parameters from Mistral AI. But first of all, the endpoint, again, you can find that in Azure AI Foundry. We're adding default request headers, which is the API key, and you're providing the Azure OpenAI API key, which again you can find in your Azure AI Foundry client. Then we're serializing our payload, same as in Mistral. We're adding request content, which is the application JSON. And then we are sending our post request to Azure AI Foundry and getting the response body that we are reading. So in here, I'm also checking if we got a success code. If not, then I'm tracing that in our Dataverse plugin trace log and returning to parent method a error message. And the next part is again parsing. So parsing part for OpenAI is quite similar to Mistral AI. Only difference being is that the response object from OpenAI is a little bit different. So, but the general idea stands the same. We are parsing our response body into JObject variable. Then we're checking if that JObject variable contains choices array. In Mistral AI, we had pages array, but in here we have choices. And then we are checking the first choice. And this choice, we are checking then if it contains the object called message. Now this message will contain the information that we actually need. There might be different objects in that choices array, but the message is the one that we're interested in. Now the message itself will have a content, and the content will be the exact string that will be returned from OpenAI. So if that content is not null or empty, we are checking if we can deserialize that content into invoice record. We're checking this here because in case OpenAI returned us not valid JSON, we would get an error, and the error would be passed to our method, our parent method, instead of something unexpected. So we are checking if we can deserialize it, and if we can, then we are just returning that content to our parent method. Other than that, we have some additional catch statements to do some error handling and to see what is actually happening. And that is it. That's everything that I can show you about the code, because after this point, the whole content is being returned to our parent method, and we already went through that part because in our parent method, we get our content, we parse it into an invoice record entity, and then we use that entity's attributes to create a record inside of our Dataverse. So apparently this is everything that I wanted to show you this time. And if you find this video thought-provoking, interesting, or maybe helpful, feel free to give it a like for the video, or subscribe, or leave a comment below. Or if you have any questions, please leave a comment below. And as always, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.